German tank crews mocked the T-34 until they faced it outside Moscow. Section 1. The First Snow of Barbarossa. November 30th, 1941. West of Moscow, near the frozen approaches to Klin. The engine of Unteroffizier Karl Weiss's Panzer III coughed in protest as he slammed the hatch shut. Diesel fumes mixed with the sharp metallic smell of cold steel, hanging thick inside the cramped fighting compartment. Outside, snow drifted sideways across the white fields, driven by a bitter wind that cut through wool coats and leather gloves alike. The world had narrowed to a periscope slit smeared with frost and the low, constant growl of an overworked Maybach engine. Weiss had fought since June. Poland had fallen quickly. France had shattered. Even the first months in Russia had felt brutal but manageable. The Red Army, they were told, was clumsy, poorly led, and technologically backward. The men believed it. They had crushed Soviet tank formations by the hundreds during the summer, burning hulks littering the roads from Minsk to Smolensk. By autumn, confidence had hardened into contempt. Now, as the Panzer Regiment crept forward through knee-deep snow, Weiss felt that confidence falter. "Movement ahead," the gunner muttered, peering through his sight. Weiss leaned forward, squinting. At first, it looked like low hills emerging from the snowstorm. Then the shapes moved. Broad hulls, wide tracks, turrets squat and unfamiliar. Russians, someone said. There was no fear in the word, only irritation. The commander laughed softly through the intercom. Probably another batch of scrap metal. German tank crews had already heard rumors of a new Soviet tank. Some had seen wrecks during the summer, abandoned or immobilized. They looked crude, almost unfinished. Rough welds, poor paint, no elegant lines like the panzers of the Wehrmacht. The men joked about them around campfires, calling them farm machines with cannons bolted on. Weiss had never faced one in combat. "Range, 800 meters, the gunner reported. "Fire," the commander ordered casually. The Panzer's 50mm gun cracked, the recoil jolting the hull. Weiss watched the tracer streak through the snow and strike the Soviet tank square on the turret front. There was a flash, then nothing. No penetration, no smoke. The Soviet tank kept moving. The intercom crackled with disbelief. "Hit confirmed," the gunner said. "No effect. Fire again." Another round slammed into the enemy tank, sparks scattering across sloped steel. The shell ricocheted away, vanishing into the storm. For the first time since crossing the Soviet border, Karl Weiss felt his stomach tighten. The Soviet tank responded. Its gun boomed, deeper and heavier than anything Weiss had heard before. Snow erupted beside the Panzer III as the shell slammed into the ground, showering the hull with frozen earth. "That's not a T-26, someone whispered. Across the line, German panzers opened fire, multiple guns hammering at once. Tracers stitched the snow. Shells struck hulls and turrets. And still the Soviet tanks advanced, their wide tracks chewing through snow that bogged down the narrower German vehicles. These were T-34s. They came on in a loose formation, turrets traversing with slow, deliberate menace. Their sloped armor deflected shot after shot, turning German confidence into confusion. Crews cursed. Gunners adjusted sights. Commanders shouted orders that no longer felt routine. Weiss watched a panzer to his left take a direct hit. The Soviet shell punched through the thinner side armor, igniting fuel and ammunition in an instant. The tank vanished in a blossom of flame, black smoke clawing into the white sky. "Reverse," the commander yelled. "Reverse now." The panzer lurched backward, tracks spinning uselessly on packed snow. The engine strained. Weiss could hear it screaming. Another Soviet round struck nearby. The shockwave slapped the hull like a giant hand. Weiss tasted blood where he'd bitten his lip. This was not how it was supposed to be. Back in the summer, German intelligence had assured commanders that Soviet industry was incapable of producing modern armored vehicles in large numbers. Heinz Guderian himself had written confidently about German technological superiority. The Panzerwaffe was the sharp edge of blitzkrieg, the instrument that had shattered Europe. Yet here outside Moscow, in the dead of winter, that edge felt suddenly blunt. Weiss glimpsed one of the Soviet tanks at close range now, less than 300 meters away. Snow clung to its hull. The turret bore crude markings, hastily painted. The welds were uneven. It looked almost unfinished, and yet it was unstoppable. The T-34's gun fired again. A Panzer IV ahead of Weiss erupted in smoke, its long-barreled 75mm gun sagging uselessly as flames poured from the engine deck. Men bailed out, silhouettes flailing against the snow, only to collapse under machine gun fire from the advancing Soviet tanks. The laughter from earlier months died in that moment. Inside the Panzer III, the crew fell silent, each man absorbed by the same unspoken realization. This enemy tank was not just new, it was better. Better armor, better mobility in snow and mud. A gun that could kill German tanks at ranges where German shells failed. Weiss thought of the jokes, the dismissive comments, the certainty that Russia was already beaten. He swallowed hard as another T-34 loomed into view, its barrel tracking toward him with cold precision. This was not scrap metal. This was the future of armored warfare, and the Wehrmacht was meeting it for the first time at the worst possible moment, on the frozen doorstep of Moscow. Section 2. Shock at the front line. December 1st, 1941. The same sector, north of Moscow. The T-34's gun fired again, and this time the shell screamed directly toward Weiss's Panzer. The impact never came. Instead, the round slammed into the ground just short, detonating in a violent spray of ice and dirt that rattled the hull like a hammer blow. Weiss was thrown forward, his helmet cracking against the interior steel. For a brief, disorienting second, the only sound inside the tank was the high-pitched ringing in his ears. "Driver, move!" the commander shouted, his voice raw now, stripped of confidence. "Get us behind that tree lean." The driver forced the throttle down. The Panzer lurched, tracks clawing desperately for purchase. Snow packed into the suspension, freezing hard around the road wheels. The German tank was never designed for this kind of terrain. The Eastern Front had exposed that flaw brutally. Behind them, the Soviet tanks did not struggle. Their wide tracks distributed weight evenly, letting them glide across snow where German vehicles bogged down. The T-34 that had targeted Weiss adjusted its aim calmly, almost methodically, as if time itself belonged to it. Another shot rang out. This one struck a Panzer II farther down the line, punching through the thin armor with contemptuous ease. The small tank burst into flames instantly. There was no escape. Over the radio, voices overlapped in panic. "They're impervious. Our shells are bouncing off. Artillery support now." Static swallowed half the transmissions. Soviet jamming and the chaos of battle made coordination nearly impossible. What had begun as a routine engagement had turned into a nightmare of confusion and disbelief. For months, German doctrine had taught that superior training and coordination could overcome inferior enemy equipment. But here, outside Moscow, training alone was not enough. The laws of physics were not on Germany's side. Weiss finally reached the cover of a shallow depression. The Panzer shuddered to a halt. The gunner swung the turret, searching desperately for a weak spot. The commander barked rapid instructions, his earlier calm replaced by a sharp edge of fear he could no longer hide. "Aim for the tracks. Disable it." The gunner fired. The shell struck the lower hull of a T-34, sparks flashing brightly. For a heartbeat, Weiss dared to hope. Then the Soviet tank kept moving, its tracks intact, its advance unbroken. Inside the Panzer III, the air felt suddenly thin. German crews had studied enemy tanks carefully. They knew where French armor was weakest. They knew how to outmaneuver British Matildas. But the T-34 was different. Its sloped armored deflected shells that would have penetrated vertical plates. Its diesel engine reduced the chance of catastrophic fires. Its gun outranged most German weapons currently deployed. This was not just a tactical problem. It was a strategic shock. The commander slammed his fist against the turret wall. "Where did they get these?" he shouted, more to himself than anyone else. Far from the front, deep inside the Soviet Union, Entire factories have been dismantled and moved east beyond the men, women, and even teenagers worked around the clock in freezing conditions, producing tanks with ruthless efficiency. Fit and finish mattered less than function. If a weld was ugly but strong, it stayed. If paint was uneven, no one cared. Every hour, save meant another tank at the front. That reality was about to collide head-on with German assumptions. As Weiss's unit struggled to hold its position, Soviet infantry appeared behind the tanks, advancing cautiously, rifles at the ready. The Red Army had learned, painfully, how to coordinate armor and infantry after the disasters of the summer. Here, in the snow, they moved with grim determination. A T-34 rolled closer, now less than 200 meters away. Its turret turned toward Weiss's Panzer. The gun barrel seemed impossibly large at this distance, like a dark tunnel pointed straight at him. "Brace!" the commander yelled. The shot came. It struck the Panzer's frontal armor at an angle, punching through with a deafening metallic scream. Inside the tank, fragments of steel sprayed like shrapnel. Weiss felt a burning pain across his shoulder as something sharp tore through his coat. The gunner slumped forward, unmoving. Smoke filled the compartment instantly. Acrid, choking, impossible to ignore. "Out! Out!" the commander screamed. Weiss fumbled with the hatch, hands slick with blood and sweat. Cold air rushed in as the hatch flew open. He scrambled out, boots slipping on icy steel, and dropped in the snow behind the wreck. Around him, the battlefield was a vision of collapse. German tanks burned in scattered clusters, black smoke rising against the pale winter sky. Soviet tanks advanced steadily through the chaos, their engines roaring with a confidence that mirrored the German advance just months earlier. Weiss pressed his face into the snow, breathing hard, trying to stay invisible. He had never felt so small, so helpless, in all his years of training in combat. By nightfall, the German unit had fallen back several kilometers. The Soviet counterattack had succeeded, punching a hole in the defensive line and forcing a hurried withdrawal. For the first time, the Germans were not advancing. They were reacting. That evening, huddled in a freezing dugout, Weiss listened as officers spoke in hushed tones. Words like unexpected, superior armor, and urgent reports to headquarters passed through the darkness. No one laughed anymore. Somewhere far behind the lines, staff officers would begin writing after-action reports. They would describe the new Soviet tank in clinical language, listing armor thickness, gun caliber, and mobility. They would underline the word shock. And higher still, men like General Heinz Guderian would read those reports and feel something unfamiliar settle into their thoughts. Doubt. The war in the East was no longer unfolding according to German plans. And the T-34, once mocked as a crude machine, had announced itself as a weapon capable of changing everything. Section 3. Reports that shook the command. December 2nd, 1941. Army Group Center Headquarters near Smolensk. The stove in the command hut glowed red, but it did little to fight the cold. Maps lay spread across a rough wooden table, their edges curling from damp air and constant handling. Red and blue pencil lines crisscrossed the paper, marking advances that had slowed, then stopped, and now bent backward under Soviet pressure. Colonel Erhard Rouse stood hunched over the maps, his gloves still on. He had just returned from the front, his face drawn, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. In his hand was a folder thick with field reports, the ink already smudged by snow and sweat. "These are not isolated encounters," Rouse said quietly, breaking the silence. "The enemy is deploying them in numbers." Across from him, a senior staff officer frowned. "You're certain?" Rouse nodded. "Multiple panzer divisions. Same observations everywhere. Sloped armor. High mobility. Our standard anti-tank guns are ineffective at normal combat ranges." The officer exhaled slowly. Outside, wind rattled the walls of the hut like distant artillery fire. For months, German intelligence assessments had painted the Red Army as a hollow force. The purges of the 1930s. Poor leadership. Inferior technology. All of it had reinforced the belief that victory in the East was inevitable. Now, that narrative was collapsing under the weight of first-hand experience. Rouse opened the folder and slid several pages across the table. Crews report that even the Panzer IV struggles unless it can engage from the flank at close range. The Panzer III is largely ineffective head-on. Infantry anti-tank weapons are nearly useless. Another officer shook his head in disbelief. How could we have missed this? The answer was uncomfortable. German planners had underestimated Soviet industrial capacity and adaptability. They had assumed that whatever modern equipment the Soviets possessed existed only in small quantities. The T-34 shattered that assumption. Farther west, in a drafty headquarters near Orel, General Heinz Guderian read similar reports by lamplight. He removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes, and read them again. Shells bouncing off frontal armor. Superior cross-country performance. Diesel engines. Wide tracks. Guderian had built his reputation on armored warfare. He understood tanks not as symbols, but as systems. And the system described in these reports disturbed him deeply. This tank, he wrote later, was a completely new and unknown type. For the first time since the invasion began, German armored commanders were not dictating the terms of engagement. They were reacting to an enemy advantage. At the front, Weiss and the survivors of his unit were reorganized and reassigned. Replacement tanks arrived, but they were the same models as before. The same guns. The same armor. Nothing had changed except the enemy. Orders came down emphasizing caution. Avoid frontal engagements. Call for artillery. Seek flanking shots. Delay, withdraw, survive. These were not the orders of an advancing army. They were the language of containment. On December 3rd, Weiss found himself riding atop a supply truck, clutching his rifle for warmth as the convoy crawled through snow-choked roads. Burned-out tanks lined the route, grim markers of recent fighting. Some were German. Others were Soviet, but fewer than expected. A passing officer pointed at a blackened T-34 half-buried in snow. That one took artillery, he said. Direct hit. Weiss nodded, saying nothing. He knew what that meant. It had not been killed by another tank. That night, under a sky glittering with cold stars, Weiss listened to veterans speak in low voices. They talked about Russia differently now. Not as a backward land to be conquered, but as a place that fought back, hard, relentlessly, and with weapons they had not expected. Meanwhile, Soviet crews learned quickly. They discovered that German tanks were faster on roads, but struggled off them. They learned to exploit snow, mud, and distance. Each engagement sharpened their confidence. The balance of fear was shifting. In Berlin, the reports finally reached the highest levels. Engineers and ordnance officers pored over captured photographs and sketches. Meetings grew tense. Questions were asked that had no easy answers. Why was German armor inferior in this domain? How quickly could new guns be deployed? What would it take to counter the T-34? Winter pressed in harder with each passing day. Temperatures plunged. Engines froze. Weapons jammed. Men suffered frostbite by the thousands. And beneath it all lay a growing, unspoken realization. If Germany could not regain armored superiority, the entire logic of blitzkrieg in the East was broken. The T-34 had not merely stopped a few panzer divisions. It had forced the Wehrmacht to confront a future it was not prepared for, one where speed and confidence alone were no longer enough. Section 4. The Winter Counterblow. December 5th, 1941. Dawn outside Moscow. The sky was a pale gray sheet, heavy with low clouds that promised more snow. The temperature had dropped well below zero overnight. Frost clung to every exposed surface, turning rifles, helmets, and tank hulls into brittle, ice-sheathed objects. Breath came out in thick white plumes, instantly freezing on scarves and collars. Karl Weiss stood in a shallow trench, his shoulder bandaged, his rifle held more for comfort than expectation. Somewhere to his left, an engine roared to life. Not a Maybach, but the deeper, throaty growl of a Soviet diesel. The Red Army had waited. Now it struck. Artillery thundered across the frozen fields, the ground shuddering with each impact. Snow and ice exploded skyward, raining down, and out of the haze emerged dark shapes, moving steadily forward. Lines of infantry advanced behind them, hunched against the cold, rifles slung, boots crunching through the snow. At the front rolled the tanks, dozens of them. T-34s. They advanced in depth, not the scattered rushes of earlier months, but with discipline and coordination. Their turrets traversed slowly, scanning for threats. Their wide tracks churned through snow that trapped German vehicles in place. German anti-tank guns opened fire. Muzzle flashes flickered like dying stars. Shells struck Soviet armor and skidded away harmlessly, leaving scars that steamed faintly in the cold air. Weiss watched as a 37mm gun crew fired again and again, the recoil rocking the small weapon backward. AT-34 took the hits without slowing. Then it fired once. The anti-tank gun vanished in a burst of flame and twisted metal. The Soviet offensive rolled forward with terrifying momentum. German commanders tried to organize a defense. Orders crackled over radios, often drowned out by static or artillery. Panzer units attempted counterattacks, but engines refused to start, oil thickened by cold. When tanks did move, they struggled to maneuver, tracks slipping uselessly. The T-34s did not share those problems. Their diesel engines tolerated the cold better. Their wide tracks gripped snow and ice. Their crews, many wearing quilted jackets and felt boots, pressed forward with a grim determination born of desperation and belief. Weiss felt the ground shake as a T-34 passed less than 50 meters from his position. Its hull loomed like a moving wall of steel, scarred and pitted but unstoppable. He could hear the clatter of its tracks, the rumble of its engine, the clank of internal mechanisms working in cold harmony. For a fleeting moment, he made eye contact with the Soviet commander through the open hatch. The man's face was windburned, eyes narrowed, jaw set. There was no triumph there, only focus. This was not a reckless charge. This was a calculated push. All along the front, the pattern repeated. German units fell back, step by step, sometimes running, sometimes fighting desperately to hold ground long enough for others to escape. Entire divisions were pushed out of positions they had bled to take. For the first time, Moscow did not feel like a prize just out of reach. It felt distant, untouchable. By nightfall, the Soviet counteroffensive had forced a general German retreat. Hitler's earlier orders to stand fast collided with reality on the ground. Units that refused to withdraw were encircled or destroyed. Survival now depended on flexibility, something German doctrine had prized, but which political interference increasingly denied. Weiss and his comrades marched through the night, boots frozen stiff, fingers numb, faces hollow. Tanks burned behind them, marking the path of retreat with pillars of smoke. In makeshift headquarters, officers stared at maps with widening gaps. The front line no longer formed a clean arc. It sagged, frayed, and in places snapped entirely. And always, in the reports, the same words appeared. Enemy tank superiority, increased mobility, inability to engage frontally. The T-34 had become more than a weapon. It was a symbol of Soviet resilience, of German miscalculation, and of a war that was no longer following the script written in Berlin. As the Red Army pushed westward, reclaiming ground inch by inch, a grim truth settled over the Wehrmacht. The road to Moscow was closed, and the machine that had helped close it had been mocked, dismissed, and underestimated, until it proved in fire and snow that the future of armored warfare no longer belonged to Germany. Section 5. Inside the Steel Beast. December 7th, 1941. Somewhere east of Kalinin. The inside of the T-34 was dark, cramped, and deafening. Condensation dripped from the steel walls, freezing in thin sheets where the heat of the engine failed to reach. The smell was a constant mix of diesel fuel, burnt oil, sweat, and cordite. Every movement had to be deliberate. There was no wasted space, no comfort, no silence. Sergeant Ivan Petrov wiped frost from his eyebrows with the back of his glove, and leaned into the periscope. The glass was scratched, imperfect, but it was enough. Ahead of him, the white landscape rolled endlessly, broken by blackened wrecks and shallow trenches carved into the snow. German tanks, the gunner said, his voice flat, professional. Petrov nodded. He had learned to trust that tone. Panic had no place inside this machine. The T-34 lurched forward, its suspension groaning as it crossed frozen ground. The engine growled steadily behind them, a sound Petrov had come to associate with survival. He remembered the training grounds months earlier, instructors shouting over the roar of engines, emphasizing one lesson above all others. Keep moving. Speed was life. Armor was life. Distance was life. Petrov had grown up on a collective farm near Kharkov. Before the war, he had never seen a tank up close. Now he lived inside one. He knew every vibration, every rattle, every quirk of the machine. He knew how it behaved in mud, in snow, in deep cold. He knew that its welds were ugly, that its interior finish was crude. He also knew that German shells often bounced off its front armor like stones thrown at a barn. Range, he asked. 500 meters. Fire. The gun thundered, the recoil slamming through the turret. The shell streaked across the snow and struck a Panzer III head-on. The German tank shuddered, then erupted in flame. Petrov did not cheer. He did not smile. He simply ordered the loader to prepare the next round. For Soviet crews, the T-34 was not a symbol of technological triumph. It was a tool, brutally effective, imperfect, and often unforgiving to its own operators. Visibility was poor. The turret was cramped. Early models lacked radios, forcing commanders to rely on flags or hand signals. Crew coordination demanded constant practice under fire. But when it worked decisively. Petrov had seen what German tanks could do. He had watched villages burn under panzer guns during the summer retreats. He had buried friends killed by shrapnel and machine gun fire. Now, for the first time, he felt the balance shift. The T-34 surged forward again, tracks biting into snow. Petrov spotted German infantry scattering, firing rifles that could do nothing to stop the advancing steel. A few anti-tank guns barked defiantly, their shells sparking harmlessly against the sloped armor. Too light, the gunner muttered. Petrov allowed himself a brief, grim satisfaction. This machine had been born out of desperation. Soviet designers had studied foreign tanks, learned painful lessons during earlier conflicts, and chosen function over refinement. Sloped armor increased protection without adding weight. A powerful gun gave it reach. Wide tracks allowed it to go where others could not. It was not elegant. It was relentless. As Petrov's unit pressed forward, he passed burned-out German tanks half buried in snow. Some bore black crosses, others only twisted steel. The war had stripped them of identity, leaving only wreckage behind. In the distance, artillery flashed. Soviet infantry followed closely, using the tanks as moving shields. This was combined arms warfare, improvised and imperfect, but growing more effective with each passing day. Petrov knew the Germans would adapt. They always did. New guns would come. New tactics. Stronger tanks. But here, now, in this winter, the advantage belonged to the Red Army. As darkness fell, the T-34s halted in a captured village. Engines were shut down, metal ticking as it cooled. Crews climbed out, stamping their feet against the cold, sharing cigarettes and bread in the shadow of their machines. Petrov leaned against the hull, its steel still warm beneath his hand. He looked west, toward where the Germans were retreating, and felt something he had not felt since the war began. Hope. The T-34 had not ended the war, but it had given the Soviet Union something precious: time. Time to regroup. Time to learn. Time to turn survival into resistance, and resistance into something more. And far away, in German headquarters, engineers and generals were coming to the same conclusion from the opposite direction. They were no longer fighting the enemy they had expected. Section 6. The Reckoning in Berlin. December 8, 1941. Berlin. Snow fell softly onto the wide avenues of the capital, muffling the sounds of traffic and boots alike. From the outside, the city appeared calm, untouched by the chaos consuming the Eastern Front. Inside the government ministries and military offices, however, tension hung thick in the air. In a high-ceilinged conference room, senior officers of the Wehrmacht gathered around a long table. Lamps cast harsh pools of light on stacks of reports, photographs, and technical sketches. Every document pointed to the same uncomfortable truth. The enemy had fielded a superior tank. General officers leaned forward as engineers spoke, their voices clipped and precise. Armor thickness was measured. Angles were calculated. Penetration tables were reviewed again and again. The slope of the frontal armor increases effective thickness significantly, one engineer explained. Our current anti-tank weapons are inadequate at standard combat ranges. A murmur rippled through the room. Another officer added, its mobility in snow and mud exceeds that of our Panzer III and IV. The wide tracks are a major factor. The words sounded clinical, but the implications were anything but. Adolf Hitler entered the room abruptly, his presence freezing the conversation mid-sentence. He listened in silence as summaries were repeated. His expression hardened with each point. This tank, he said finally, must be destroyed. There was no argument with that. The question was how. Orders went out immediately. New weapons were to be accelerated. Existing guns were to be modified. Captured T-34s were to be shipped to Germany for detailed study. Every scrap of information from the front was to be collected and analyzed. The German war machine had always responded to challenges with engineering brilliance. The question was whether it could respond fast enough. At the front, Weiss learned of these developments only indirectly. Rumors filtered down through the ranks. New tanks were coming, bigger guns, thicker armor. But rumors did not stop Soviet shells. On December 10th, Weiss's unit was ordered to hold a defensive line along a frozen river. The position was poorly chosen, exposed, and difficult to resupply. Yet the order was clear. No further retreat without permission. Weiss stared across the ice, watching as Soviet reconnaissance units probed their defenses. He knew what would follow. Artillery, tanks, infantry. The T-34s would come again. Behind the lines, German engineers worked feverishly. They examined the captured Soviet tank like surgeons studying a dangerous new disease. They measured welds, examined armor composition, and tested gun penetration. Some were impressed. Others were unsettled. This is not craftsmanship, one muttered, running a hand over a rough seam. No, another replied. It is efficiency. The realization cut deep. German engineering had prized precision, finish, and complexity. The Soviet approach stripped everything down to what was necessary to survive and kill. Design philosophies collided on the frozen fields outside Moscow. The result would shape the next phase of the war. Back at the front, Weiss heard the distant rumble of engines once more. He felt it through the ground before he saw it. The unmistakable vibration of advancing armor. He checked his rifle, his hands steady despite the cold. Fear had burned itself out, replaced by a dull acceptance. This was no longer about mocking an enemy's machines. It was about enduring them. And as the first silhouettes of T-34s emerged from the snow, Weiss understood fully what his commanders were only beginning to grasp. The war of the East had changed irrevocably. Type TEEP to generate the next section. Section 7, Learning the Hard Way. December 12, 1941. Along the Lama River defensive line, the cold had become something alive. It crept into boots, into joints, into thoughts. Frostbite was no longer an exception, but a daily threat, claimed quietly in aid stations where fingers and toes blackened without ceremony. Karl Weiss crouched behind a low embankment, binoculars pressed to his eyes. Across the frozen river, Soviet tanks waited, dark shapes half veiled by drifting snow. They were not charging. They were watching. This was new. Earlier in the war, Soviet attacks had been blunt, often wasteful. Now, there was patience. Reconnaissance units probed weak points. Artillery softened positions methodically. Tanks moved only when conditions favored them. The Red Army was learning. German units, Two were adapting, but painfully. New instructions circulated at the company level, typed hastily on thin paper. Engage only from the flank. Avoid open ground. Coordinate with artillery at all costs. If possible, withdraw before contact. None of this aligned with the spirit in which the men had been trained. Weiss remembered the early days of the invasion, the speed, the confidence, the sense that momentum itself was a weapon. Now, every kilometer gained was measured in blood and exhaustion, every hold line temporary. The first Soviet artillery rounds landed just after dawn. They were not massive barges, but precise, deliberate strikes. Snow geysered into the air, burying trenches and shaking nerves already stretched thin. Then the tanks moved. The T-34s advanced slowly, deliberately, as if daring the Germans to fire. Anti-tank guns barked. Shells struck. Ricochets flashed and vanished into white emptiness. One gun crew fired until the barrel glowed faintly, then fled as a Soviet shell erased their position in a thunderous blast. Weiss watched as a German panzer attempted a flanking maneuver along the riverbank. Its tracks slipped on ice. The tank stalled, helpless. A T-34 rotated its turret and fired once. The panzer burned. There was no drama, no hesitation, just cause and effect. By midday, the German line had bent again. Orders came to fall back to secondary positions. Weiss moved with his squad through a pine forest, branches heavy with snow, the silence broken only by distant gunfire and the crunch of boots. As they withdrew, Weiss passed a knocked-out T-34, its hull split by an artillery hit. The turret lay twisted, the interior blackened. For a moment, he stared at it, studying the machine that had changed everything. It was ugly, brutal, efficient, and it could be destroyed, but only with effort, coordination, and weapons Germany had not yet fielded in sufficient numbers. That evening, as darkness swallowed the forest, Weiss sat with his comrades around a small fire, barely more than glowing embers. No one spoke much. The war had stripped conversation down to essentials. One man finally broke the silence. "They'll bring something bigger," he said. "They have to." Weiss did not answer. He thought of the reports, the engineers in Berlin, the promises of new machines. He wondered how many winters would pass before those promises reached the front, and whether it would be too late. Behind Soviet lines, Ivan Petrov received orders to advance again at first light. His crew checked the engine, cleaned the gun, shared a few words over frozen bread. They were tired. They were cold. But they believed now, not in victory tomorrow or next week, but in the simple fact that they could fight back. The T-34 had given them that belief. As both sides prepared for another day of combat, one truth hung unspoken over the frozen battlefield. The mocking laughter of summer 1941 was gone forever. In its place stood a war of adaptation, endurance, and steel, a war the Germans had not planned for, and one the Soviets were beginning, slowly and painfully, to master. Section 8. A new arms race begins. December 18, 1941. Kummersdorf Proving Ground, south of Berlin. The captured Soviet tank sat alone on the snow-dusted test field, its silhouette unmistakable even at a distance. German technicians circled it slowly, notebooks in hand, boots crunching against frozen ground. The blackened numbers on its turret were chipped, the paint worn thin, but the machine itself radiated a blunt, intimidating presence. This T-34 had been hauled hundreds of miles from the Eastern Front. It bore the scars of battle, dents, gouges, and burn marks where German shells had struck and failed. To the men examining it now, those scars were not signs of crude workmanship. They were evidence. Engineers climbed inside, bumping their heads against tight clearances, cursing the lack of space. They tested the turret traverse, examined the gun breech, measured armor angles again and again. One of them finally broke the silence. "It's not refined," he said, "but it's clever." That word carried weight. German armor doctrine had been built on precision. Every component engineered to tight tolerances, every system optimized. The T-34 ignored that philosophy entirely. It accepted discomfort for the crew. It sacrificed visibility. It simplified production. And in doing so, it achieved something Germany had not. It could be built fast, in vast numbers, by a nation fighting for survival. The realization struck like a hammer blow. Back at the front, Weiss felt the effects of this delayed understanding in the most brutal way possible. On December 20th, his unit received orders to counterattack a Soviet breakthrough near a small village whose name barely registered anymore. The attack began at dawn. Snow fell thick and wet, reducing visibility to a few dozen meters. German tanks advanced cautiously, engines straining, guns scanning for movement. They found it soon enough. T-34s emerged from the snowfall like phantoms, firing on the move. One German tank was hit, then another. The survivors tried to maneuver, to flank, to fight the way they had been trained. But the terrain betrayed them. Weiss watched as a Panzer IV fired repeatedly at a Soviet tank's front armor. Each shot glanced away. The T-34 returned fire once. The Panzer exploded, its turret lifted clean off the hull. The counterattack collapsed within minutes. As Weiss pulled back once more, numb with exhaustion, he understood something fundamental. This was no longer a series of isolated engagements. It was a systemic problem. Germany had lost the initiative in armored warfare. Meanwhile, Ivan Petrov's crew pressed forward again, advancing through wreckage that told the story of adaptation and progress. German anti-tank guns were now heavier. Artillery fire was more accurate. The enemy was learning. But so were they. Petrov adjusted tactics, coordinating closely with infantry, avoiding predictable routes, exploiting terrain. The T-34 was strong, but it was not invincible. Survival depended on judgment as much as armor. At night, Petrov listened to distant gunfire and thought about the rumors circulating among the crews. The Germans were building new tanks. Bigger, heavier, more powerful. Let them, his loader said once, quietly. They still have to get them here. It was a simple statement, and it carried the brutal logic of the Eastern Front. In Berlin, meetings stretched late into the night. New designs were sketched. Existing ones were revised. The Panther project gathered momentum, its specifications shaped directly by the lessons learned from the T-34. Sloped armor, wider tracks, a high-velocity gun. Germany was chasing its enemy now, reacting rather than leading. Winter deepened. The front stabilized temporarily, frozen in place by weather and exhaustion. But beneath the stillness, the war accelerated in a different way, in factories, design bureaus, and test grounds. An arms race had begun, and it had been triggered not by a grand offensive or a decisive battle, but by a tank once dismissed as crude and inferior. A machine that had forced the Wehrmacht to confront an enemy it could no longer laugh at. Section 9. The Cost of Underestimation. January 2nd, 1942. The outskirts of Rzhev. The new year arrived without celebration. No fireworks. No speeches. Only the distant thud of artillery and the groan of trees splitting under the cold. The temperature had plunged to levels few of the German soldiers had ever experienced. Metal shattered if struck too hard. Skin froze in minutes. Karl Weiss no longer marked the days. Time had become a blur of movement, exhaustion, and fear. His unit was a shadow of what it had been in November. Replacements arrived sporadically. Young men with hollow eyes who learned the reality of the front within hours. They were told to dig in. The Soviets attacked again, not with reckless waves, but with measured force. T-34s advanced in support of infantry assaults, breaking strong points one by one. Artillery followed, then engineered. German artillery fired, landing short, then long. Adjustments came too late. A T-34 turned its turret deliberately and fired. The farmhouse shuddered as the shell struck nearby, plaster and wood exploding inward. Weiss threw himself to the floor, heart pounding. This was the price of misjudgment, of assuming the enemy could not learn, could not adapt, could not innovate. At higher command levels, the cost was becoming undeniable. Casualty reports grew longer. Equipment losses mounted. Supply lines strained under constant pressure and impossible distances. The winter offensive had not destroyed Army Group Center, but had broken the illusion of invincibility. In Soviet rear areas, factories continued to pour out tanks despite evacuations, shortages, and brutal working conditions. Production numbers rose even as cities froze and workers collapsed from exhaustion. Quantity became a weapon in itself. Ivan Petrov received a new T-34 to replace one damaged by mechanical failure. The machine was rougher than his last. The welds uglier. The interior smelled of fresh paint and hot metal. It did not matter. The gun fired true. The engine ran. The tracks moved. That was enough. Petrov's unit pushed westward again, reclaiming villages the Germans had taken months earlier. Each kilometer felt like a small victory, not just over the enemy, but over despair. Back in Berlin, the consequences of earlier arrogance were debated behind closed doors. Some officers spoke openly now about mistakes. Others deflected blame. The truth sat uncomfortably between them. Germany had entered a war of attrition against a nation that excelled at absorbing punishment. And the T-34 was at the center of that reality. For Weiss, the realization came one quiet morning as he stood watch over a frozen field littered with wreckage. German and Soviet tanks lay scattered together, indistinguishable beneath snow and ice. He understood then that the war would not end quickly, that there would be no easy victories, no swift triumphs, only years of grinding combat, shaped by machines and men pushed beyond their limits. The mocking laughter of 1941 had turned into silence, and in that silence, the future of the Eastern Front was being written. One engagement, one frozen battlefield, one unstoppable tank at a time. Section 10. The Shadow of the Future. January 15th, 1942. Eastern Front, Army Group Center rear area. The front had settled into an uneasy stillness. Snow lay undisturbed across fields where thousands had died only weeks earlier. The guns were quieter now, not from peace, but from exhaustion. Men used the silence to repair weapons, to bury the dead, to think. Karl Weiss sat on an ammunition crate inside a ruined barn, his back against splintered wood. A candle flickered weakly, throwing long shadows across the frozen floor. In his hands was a letter from home, the paper thin, the ink faint. He read it slowly, carefully, as if speed might somehow shorten the moment of calm. Outside, a tank engine started. Weiss looked up instinctively, heart tightening, until he recognized the sound. German. Familiar. Weak. The Panzer idled unevenly, coughing in the cold, its crew hunched close to the hull for warmth. It looked tired, as if the machine itself knew it no longer ruled the battlefield. Across the lines, Soviet units prepared for the next phase of the war. Ivan Petrov stood with his crew beside their tank as mechanics adjusted the track tension. Snow fell steadily, settling into the grooves of the armor. New orders, the platoon commander said. We advance in 3 days. Petrov nodded. He no longer asked where or how far. Those details mattered less than the fact that they were moving west. The T-34 had given the Red Army momentum, but momentum was fragile. German resistance remained fierce. New anti-tank guns had appeared. Artillery fire had grown more accurate. Every kilometer still had to be fought for. Yet something fundamental had changed. German units now treated the T-34 with respect bordering on fear. Engagements were planned carefully. Commanders hesitated before committing armor. The confidence that had defined Blitzkrieg was gone, replaced by caution and calculation. In Germany, design bureaus worked around the clock. Blueprints were revised repeatedly. Prototypes took shape. Heavier, more powerful machines meant to reclaim dominance. The Panther was no longer a concept. It was becoming reality. Its specifications mirrored lessons learned the hard way. Sloped armor to deflect shells. A long-barreled gun to penetrate at range. Wide tracks to cope with mud and snow. The irony was not lost on those who understood it. Germany was building a tank inspired by the very machine it had mocked. On the Eastern Front, Weiss felt the consequences of this shift in small but telling ways. Orders emphasized survival. Withdrawal was no longer seen as cowardice. Holding ground at all costs was quietly abandoned in favor of preserving forces. This was not defeat, but was not victory either. It was adaptation under pressure. One night, Weiss shared a cigarette with a veteran sergeant who had fought since Poland. The man exhaled smoke into the freezing air and stared into the darkness. "We thought they were fools," he said quietly. "Turns out, we were wrong." Weiss nodded. There was nothing more to say. For Petrov, the war had become a test of endurance rather than survival alone. He had learned to trust his crew completely, to read the battlefield instinctively, to recognize the sound of incoming fire before it arrived. The T-34 was no longer just protection. It was familiarity, a harsh, unforgiving companion that demanded respect in return. As January dragged on, both sides prepared for what came next. The German retreat had been halted, but the cost had been immense. The Soviet counteroffensive had proven the Red Army could fight, could adapt, could win. The winter battles outside Moscow had not decided the war, but they had decided something equally important. They had revealed the future, a future where industrial strength, adaptability, and ruthless efficiency mattered more than initial brilliance. A future where no enemy could be dismissed as backward or inferior. And at the center of that future stood a tank with rough welds, cramped interiors, and sloped armor. A machine that had been laughed at until it forced the Wehrmacht to confront the limits of its own confidence. Section 11. When Doctrine Collided with Reality. February 3, 1942. German Rear Headquarters, Eastern Front. The briefing room smelled of damp wool and stale coffee. Officers stood shoulder to shoulder, boots planted on warped floorboards as a major traced lines across a map with a wooden pointer. The red arrows were fewer now, shorter, cautious. The blue lines curved defensively, layered, tentative. "This," the major said, tapping the map near Vyazma, "is where we will hold." No one argued. No one even nodded. The men in the room understood what was unspoken. The war they had trained for, rapid breakthroughs, sweeping encirclements, decisive armored thrusts, had collided with a battlefield that refused to behave as expected. The Eastern Front had devoured doctrine and spat out something harsher in its place. Karl Weiss listened from the back, his cap pulled low, his face leaner than it had been in November. He had learned to read these briefings not by what was said, but by what was avoided. There was no talk of Moscow anymore. No timelines. No promises. Only holding actions. Outside, mechanics worked silently on damaged tanks, scavenging parts from wrecks to keep a handful running. Each machine was treated like a precious resource now, not an expendable spearhead. The Panzerwaffe had become careful. Across the frozen expanse, Ivan Petrov attended his own briefing, held in a dugout reinforced with logs and frozen earth. A young lieutenant spoke plainly, his breath fogging the air. "The Germans are dug in," he said. "They will counterattack if we overextend. Tanks advance only with infantry support. Artillery precedes all movement." There was no rhetoric, no grand speeches, just instructions born of hard experience. The Red Army had learned that courage without coordination meant death. The T-34 gave them an advantage, but it did not forgive mistakes. Petrov studied the map. He noticed how the Soviet arrows now curved, too. Not reckless lunges, but deliberate pushes designed to unbalance, not annihilate. This was no longer desperation. It was method. On February 6th, the two doctrines met again in a clash near a frozen crossroads. German units attempted a limited counterattack, hoping to regain ground and test Soviet strength. The shell punched through the side armor, flames licking from the impact point. The tank ground to a halt, smoke pouring from its hatches. "It can be killed," someone shouted. The words carried a strange relief. But the cost was immediate. Two more T-34s advanced, flanking the gun position. Their return fire obliterated it in seconds. Infantry followed, sealing the engagement. The lesson cut both ways. The T-34 was not invulnerable. and German forces, when properly equipped and coordinated, could fight back. But the margin for error had narrowed to almost nothing. After the engagement, Weiss stood near the wreck of the Soviet tank, studying the penetration hole. He felt no triumph, only a grim respect. This was what the war had become, a contest not of superiority, but of adaptation speed. In the weeks that followed, reports flowed steadily in both directions. Soviet commanders noted German improvements. German officers cataloged Soviet tactics. Each side learned, adjusted, and learned again. The battlefield itself became the teacher. For Petrov, February brought new replacements to his crew. One was barely 19, hands shaking as he climbed into the tank for the first time. "Stay close," Petrov told him quietly. "Watch. Listen. You'll learn." That was how knowledge passed now, not through manuals or slogans, but through survival. By the end of winter, one fact was undeniable to both sides. The T-34 had not won the war outside Moscow, but it had destroyed an illusion. Germany could be matched, outproduced, outadapted, and once that truth took root, it spread faster than any tank column ever could. Section 11. When Doctrine Collided with Reality. February 3rd, 1942. Near Vyazma. The snow had been trampled into gray sludge by months of movement and shell fire. What once looked like an endless white expanse was now scarred, churned, and littered with the debris of war. Burned vehicles lay half-buried along the roadside, their twisted frames frozen in place like relics of a past age. Karl Weiss moved carefully through the wreckage, his breath shallow in the cold air. His unit had been ordered to probe Soviet positions ahead, a cautious advance meant to test resistance rather than break it. The language of orders had changed. Words like exploit and breakthrough had vanished. In their place came observe, delay, withdraw if necessary. Blitzkrieg had given way to survival. Ahead, Soviet defenses were layered and deliberate. Trenches zigzagged through frozen ground. Anti-tank guns were camouflaged with snow and branches. Infantry positions overlapped, covering each other with disciplined fire. And behind them, waiting, were the tanks. Weiss spotted the silhouette of a T-34 hull down behind a low ridge. Only the turret was visible, its barrel steady, patient. It did not fire immediately. It waited. This was the difference. German doctrine had emphasized initiative and speed, striking before the enemy could react. But here, the enemy was reacting first, shaping the battlefield, choosing the moment. German artillery opened fire, probing Soviet lines. The response came swiftly and accurately. Shells walked across the ground with grim precision, forcing Weiss's squad to take cover. When the T-34 finally moved, it did so decisively. The turret rotated. The gun fired. A German armored car vanished in smoke. The engagement ended quickly. Weiss's unit withdrew as ordered, leaving behind nothing but tracks and spent casings. No ground was gained. No advantage seized. Only information. Far to the west, German analysts studied reports from dozens of such encounters. Patterns emerged. Soviet armor was no longer used recklessly. It was integrated into a defensive doctrine that exploited terrain, weather, and numbers. The Red Army had absorbed the lessons of defeat and returned them with interest. In Soviet camps, Ivan Petrov listened as political officers and veteran commanders spoke less about ideology and more about tactics. The war had burned away illusions on both sides. Survival demanded competence. Petrov's crew practiced night maneuvers, engine maintenance under fire, rapid coordination with infantry. Mistakes were corrected harshly, sometimes brutally, but the results were undeniable. Confidence replaced desperation. On February 7th, Petrov led his tank into another engagement against German forces attempting to re-establish a defensive line. Snow fell lightly, visibility limited but manageable. The Germans tried to bait the Soviet tanks into open ground. Petrov refused. He advanced only when artillery and infantry were ready. When the T-34s moved, they moved together. German anti-tank fire struck Petrov's hull, sparks flashing harmless, along the sloped armor. He felt the impact through his boots, but the tank kept moving. "Left flank," the gunner called. Petrov responded instantly. The turret swung. The gun fired. Another German position disappeared. This was no longer a clash of improvisation against doctrine. It was doctrine against doctrine. And for the first time, the German system was not clearly superior. Weiss felt this shift acutely. The enemy no longer panicked under pressure. They anticipated. They countered. They chose when to fight. The T-34 was still the centerpiece of that transformation, but it was no longer alone. It was supported by a growing web of experience, coordination, and grim determination. As February wore on, both sides settled into a war of preparation. Germany rushed new weapons east. The Soviet Union pushed production beyond exhaustion. Men on both sides sensed that something larger was forming. The battles outside Moscow had been a warning. What followed would be a reckoning. Section 12. The End of Illusions. February 3rd, 1942. Near Vyazma. The thaw had not yet come, but the cold had changed character. It no longer shocked the men, it ground them down. Snow was compacted into gray ice by endless movement, stained by oil, blood, and soot. The landscape looked worn out, as if even the land itself had grown tired of war. Karl Weiss marched with his unit along a frozen road, his breath steady, his thoughts quieter than they had been months before. Fear no longer came in sharp spikes. It lingered, constant and dull, like the ache in his bones. He had survived the first encounter with the T-34, the retreat from Moscow, the endless winter counterblows. Survival itself had become routine. Ahead of them, German engineers labored over a knocked-out Soviet tank, partially buried in snow. The turret had been blown off by artillery, exposing the blackened interior. An officer stood nearby, pointing, dictating notes to a clerk whose pencil shook from the cold. Weiss paused for a moment, studying the wreck. Once, he would have felt triumph at the sight. Now, there was only respect. This machine had forced the Wehrmacht to abandon certainty. It had shattered the belief that superior training alone guaranteed victory. It had exposed the danger of contempt. In a dugout nearby, a junior officer read aloud excerpts from a new directive. The language was careful, measured. Enemy armored forces are to be treated as equal or superior in certain conditions. Engagements must be planned accordingly. The words would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Across the front, similar realizations took hold. German commanders no longer spoke of the Red Army collapsing. Instead, they spoke of stabilization, consolidation, preparation. The war had entered a new phase. For Ivan Petrov, February brought little rest. His unit rotated briefly out of the line, only to be reassigned days later. Repairs were constant. Losses were steady. Victory was never easy. One evening, as snow fell gently around a quiet encampment, Petrov sat on the hull of his T-34, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. He thought about how quickly the war had changed, how quickly fear had turned into resolve. The Germans were no longer careless. Their artillery was deadlier now, their tactics sharper. The enemy had learned, just as they had. That knowledge brought no comfort, only clarity. Far to the west, the first German prototypes inspired by the T-34 were already taking shape. They would be formidable when they arrived. Petrov understood that instinctively. No advantage lasted forever, but advantages mattered when they appeared. The winter of 1941 to 1942 had given the Soviet Union breathing room. It had broken the spell of inevitability that surrounded the German advance. It had proven that Moscow could not be taken at will, that Soviet industry could deliver, and that German armor could be beaten. For Weiss, the lesson was deeply standing now in the frozen silence, surrounded by the evidence of months of brutal adaptation. He understood the true cost of that laughter. It had not been harmless. It had delayed recognition. It had dulled urgency. It had blinded men to danger until danger stood directly in front of them, steel-clad and unstoppable. The T-34 had not just changed battles. It had ended illusions. As February wore on, both armies prepared for spring. What would come? Then heat. Then new offensives, new weapons, new horrors. But nothing would ever return the Wehrmacht to the certainty it had carried into Russia in June 1941. That certainty lay buried beneath the snow outside Moscow, alongside burned-out panzers and frozen dreams of quick victory. And at its grave stood a tank once mocked as inferior, a tank that had forced one of the most confident armies in history to confront reality at gunpoint.